Hello and welcome to the second Eyebrow Cinema Q&A. It's been about a year since we've done one of these, but more pertinently, we just hit 25,000 subscribers, which seemed like a good milestone to mark with a Q&A video. And they're fun to do. Before I get started, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you who've subscribed over the years and have stuck around watching my video essays. It really means a lot to me. They're a lot of fun to make, and I find them really rewarding, and it's comforting to think other people get stuff out of it too. So thank you kindly, and a thank you as well to my patrons who support the show financially and help me to make what I want to make, which is awesome. And then another disclaimer before I get into answering the questions I got through YouTube and Twitter and Patreon is quickly that a couple of people asked multiple questions, and in the interest of time, I'm only going to do one per person. So hopefully that's okay. Apologies then if you ask some good ones that don't get answered. I hope the video will still be entertaining. Okay, starting us off is Yggdrasil International, who asks, what is the movie that you changed your mind on the most? The most is almost certainly Mulholland Drive, which is a film that I went from hating when I first saw as a totally unprepared 14-year-old to really admiring and kind of loving now. In fact, I think if I watch it again, I'll like it even more than last time. But I want to say, I think I talked about that film in my last Q&A video, so I want to give another example. And I think another film that I changed my mind on in a sort of profound way would be Rebel Without a Cause, which is a film that I saw for the first time when I was in high school, and I had been a fairly serious film buff for a little while at that point, but I was just starting to really expand into like classical Hollywood movies. And I definitely liked the film okay in terms of craft, but I also felt pretty alienated from it. Part of that was I had not seen a lot of, classic Hollywood films and especially Hollywood melodramas, so the conventions of the filmmaking were different to me, and I think that put me off a little bit. But I think the more profound thing is just that I found the teen angst it was portraying a little hard to relate to, in part because, while I know teenagerhood is a very angsty time, I never really had that level of sort of drama and the sort of parental conflict in particular. I've always had a really healthy relationship with my parents, so that all seemed kind of strange. But watching the film many years later, one, I was much more acclimatized to 50s melodrama as a style with specific conventions and sort of stylistic hallmarks, so I was much more able to read those for what they are. But I think the more profound difference was that by the time of that second viewing, I was much more keenly aware of the queer subtext to the film, which went completely over my head on the first viewing, and watching it a second time from that lens, the whole thing really starts to click together in terms of like, oh yeah, now the character motivations and choices really make sense, and really resonate looked at through that angle. So that's a film I think I changed on pretty profoundly. Gus McKenzie asks, what was the biggest roadblock to you becoming a visual essayist on YouTube? Good question. The biggest roadblock was probably just myself, and I know that sounds like a really corny type of answer, your own worst enemy is you, but what I mean by that is simply I wanted to make videos for a long time before I actually started, and I would always come up with a long list of reasons of why I shouldn't or wouldn't. It's expensive, it's time consuming, I've never edited anything before, I don't really know what to do, blah blah blah, and it wasn't until a couple of events sort of pushed me into the space where I started making stuff and realized how much I liked it. One was a group assignment for a film class I was taking where we had to make a video essay, and that was super helpful in part because it was a group assignment, so I had a lot of help. I helped write and I helped edit for the first time, but I was not I was not by myself, I wasn't alone. And then the other was friends of mine who really encouraged me to make stuff and help teach me a lot. So if you're watching this, Jordan, Angeli, Kala, thank you. And that really sort of started me going, and then I was able to make stuff and started posting online and felt really good about it. In terms of being a good visual essayist or video essayist, I mean, that's just a matter of time and making stuff and learning from your mistakes and getting better as you go, and I think I'm still there. I think I'm still learning and getting better as I go. But in terms of just starting and becoming, a YouTube video essayist, it really was just me being insecure and lacking confidence to really put myself out there. So Keith Connor asks, top 3 Orson Welles movies. Go. Okay. If we're judging Welles as a director, top 3 is going to be Citizen Kane, Touch of Evil, Chimes at Midnight. If we're judging Welles as an actor, I'm going to go Citizen Kane, The Third Man, Chimes at Midnight. And the most important criteria of all, Orson Welles as a magician, I'm going to go F for Fake, Casino Royale, A Safe Place.
Oh, excuse me, madam. Sorry to keep you hanging around.
CFAT Shems asks, unlike horror, science fiction, or thriller/noir, I often feel like most cinephiles rarely dive too deeply into comedy. Everyone knows about Woody Allen, Wes Anderson, and the Coen brothers, but far less seem to be aware of the works of Albert Brooks, Alexander Payne, or Elaine May. Do you have any favorite underrated comedy films? Interesting question. I mean, you mentioned Albert Brooks, who I think is fantastic. I recently went through all of the stuff of his that was playing on the Criterion channel and thought they were uniformly very good, especially Real Life, Lost in America, and Mother. I thought all 3 of those films were extremely funny and intelligent. Modern Romance, to a lesser extent, I found that one almost too sharp in its satire that I kind of had a hard time really rooting for the characters in any way, where I think Lost in America hits a stronger balance of that. But he's fantastic. I think a lot of the comedies that I would say are underrated are less hidden gems in their own, but more the B-sides to famous comic actors and directors. So, you know, things like, for example, Harold Lloyd's famous for Safety Last, and rightfully so. It's a brilliant film. But I think also movies like Girl Shy and Why Worry and Speedy are all equally good. What's the football one? The Freshman. Yeah, so in these films, they definitely have their audience. Like, a lot of them are in the Criterion Collection. They're shown on TCM, so they're not like total unknowns, but they have less of a legacy than sort of the heavy hitters. You know, Chaplin similarly, not the Gold Rush, sorry, The Circus is often seen as like the lesser of his silent comedy feature films. And I can see why, because it's not as profound or as bold or as creative in its filmmaking as some of his other movies, especially stuff like Modern Times or City Lights. But, oh my god, is it funny. Like, gut-bustingly hilarious. Another film that hopefully I'll be talking about soon on the channel, Smiles of a Summer Night, which I specifically highlight just because I think Bergman is so thought of as like this austere, very serious, very dramatic, thoughtful, probing into the abyss type filmmaker, that people forget that he did make comedies, and of them, Smiles of a Summer Night is easily the best, and also genuinely gut-bustingly hilarious. Not really underrated or overlooked on its own. I mean, it was quite acclaimed in its day, and helped solidify Bergman as he was really starting to establish himself as one of the foremost filmmakers in the world. But I think when people look at Bergman's filmography and they consider like the cream of the crop, they by nature sort of gravitate to the really heavy dramatic works. But his comedies, and that comedy in particular, are really excellent. So those are some picks, I think, for underrated comedies. I don't know if they're that underrated, but they're the first ones that come to mind. Jean-Pierre asks, what do you think makes a movie good? Having ideas, not necessarily original, and conveying them in an engaging way through every film element, or developing a change in cinematic conventions in a way, or another approach? I know this question can end in a deconstruction of what cinema means, and maybe we'll drag the video for too long, but I'm genuinely curious. Fascinating question. I guess I'll say this, is when I reflect on my favorite films, both of all time and also just recently, I tend to gravitate to the ones that have really strong characters and really strong characterization. And I think that, for me, the primary purpose that films can serve is films are about people and illuminating people's experiences. And I think that in terms of innovating on cinematic form or executing original high concepts and ideas is important and is certainly essential to great art in any field. But I think that it should be in service, generally speaking, there are exceptions, it should be in service of character. At least that's what I tend to respond to. I recently did a video on Vertigo, which is a good example of a movie with exceptional form, a very original storyline, innovative in its structure and in some of its stylistic devices. I mean, it invented essentially its own shot in the sort of Vertigo zoom. But it's in service of really strong, fascinating characters in Scotty and Madeline/Judy. And even a lot of the side characters as well. But those two in particular are so rich and well drawn. And the themes of insecurity and control and obsession are amplified because they are attached to such strong characters. Even a movie like, to change gears, something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I think people would say, generally speaking, is more about its craft and its form and its ambitions as a piece of visual art than it is for its characters. And while I mostly agree, I also think it's crucial that it has the HAL 9000, who is not human, but he is a character who I think in a lot of ways we do relate to an extent and emotionally engage with. And actually, one of the things I find interesting the more I rewatch 2001 is how I relate to Hal differently on subsequent viewings. That's kind of a different topic. My point is that even that film, which is maybe one of the grand pinnacles of pure cinematic form and reinvention of what the filmmaking apparatus can do, it is still rooted in such a strong character. It has that connection. And if you took Hal out of that, I don't think the movie would be as good, even with all of its interesting and ambitious innovations. So, not a totally satisfying answer, a bit rambling and wishy-washy, but at least for me, when I reflect on the movies that mean the most to me, almost always there is a strong rooted character to that core that really solidifies the experience. Dara Fitzgerald asks, who most deserved the 1992 Best Actor? Nominees: Clint in Unforgiven, Robert Downey Jr. in Chaplin, Stephen Rea in The Crying Game, Al Pacino in Scent of a Woman, and Denzel Washington in Malcolm X. I honestly couldn't choose the best performance, but I'd be curious to hear your opinion on it. Well, disclaimer, I should get out of the way, I haven't seen Chaplin yet, so I can't really speak to his performance. Of the four I have seen, though, for me, easily Denzel Washington and Malcolm X. I think that's one of the pinnacle performances in film history, and is also it's Denzel's best work, but it's also a phenomenal example of what makes Denzel one of the greatest actors of all time, where the role requires the sort of intricate, introspective character work that Denzel can do brilliantly, but also that sort of movie star gravitas, because Malcolm needs to be this public figure who inspires a certain fervor in his followers and is endlessly captivating, and Denzel can play both brilliantly. He's both an immaculate movie star and a really detailed and thorough character actor. So yeah, for me, that performance is head and shoulders above the rest of the class, which is not to dismiss, I really love Clint in Unforgiven, and I think it's, judging Eastwood as an actor specifically, it's probably his best work. Probably his best work as a director too, although Letters from Iwo Jima is also in that discussion. But I think Denzel's performance as Malcolm X is one of the top 10 film performances ever. He's so good in that movie. The Movie Audio Mashup podcast asked a ton of different questions, and they were all really good, but they specified this one as the most important. What do you think is the future of cinema? Do you think we will ever get to see a time like the French New Wave or New Hollywood again, where cinema well past its prime, and now occasionally good films and directors will keep popping up, but overall the medium is dead? Again, another big question that I could spend, probably several videos on. In a lot of ways, I think the decay of cinema video is getting at some of these ideas. In terms of you mentioned the French New Wave, and I will say sort of international film movements always pop up from time to time in interesting ways. I mean, the Romanian New Wave is a fairly recent phenomenon, which produced some really fantastic works. I would argue in some ways we're still living in a golden age of Korean cinema, which started in the early 2000s when filmmakers like Park Chan-wook first burst onto the scene and was sort of lumped in as this Asian extreme movement. But now it's evolved into this really interesting state where Park Chan-wook is still making certain twisty, perverted thrillers, but they definitely play differently than something like Oldboy. I mean, The Handmaiden is one of the most brilliant movies I've seen in recent years, and it is a twisty, sexy, indulgent thriller, but it's also like this kind of extremely decadent period piece with lavish detail and also a lot of a fairly sincere love story too. And of course, Bong Joon-ho is at the height of his creative powers. Parasite, massive hit critically, financially, artistic, like in every possible measure. So in some ways, I think we're still living through in terms of like looking at film on an international scale, a creative movement located in a location that it's not quite the same as the French New Wave in that it's less of a unified sort of manifesto type approach, but in terms of regional film, a region of filmmakers sort of coming out at the same time and making exceptional works that are sort of thematically and creatively linked in various ways. I think that does still happen. In terms of cinema being dead, I mean, I don't think it's dead. I really specifically, the decay of cinema, I think, is the key phrase. And yes, I did steal it from Susan Sontag, but I do think that better reflects the state of film culture rather than it being dead, because I do genuinely believe that great films and great filmmakers are emerging all the time, every day. Even in 2020, a year where the new releases were severely limited because of the pandemic and a lot of stuff being pushed back, I still found tons of movies that I loved, and even movies that if I didn't love, I still thought were doing interesting and provocative things, or movies that I still haven't caught up with yet that are sort of being celebrated for doing interesting, provocative, ambitious things. So I guess what it comes down to, and the kind of point I'm building to, and I think the decay of cinema was hopefully also trying to get at, is the notion that at the end of the day, when we're discussing film culture in large terms, the bigger issues are less the films themselves and the filmmakers and how good or bad they are, and more the overall structure of film culture in terms of technological development and the distribution and exhibition of movie making. So what that future actually looks like, I don't know. I really don't feel comfortable saying. I mean, there's a lot of speculation about the death of movie theaters, for example, which I think would be I don't think would lead to the death of cinema per se, but I think would be a crushing blow to film culture. Because, I mean, streaming is a wonderful thing, and I'm also, as you can tell, a fan of home video, but nothing beats the theatrical experience, and to lose that on a grand scale would be, I think, a pretty devastating blow to what the cinema is. I guess to sum up what I'm saying as a quick soundbite, I genuinely don't believe cinema will ever die, or at least won't until, like, the human race dies. But in terms of the culture of cinema going, that I think is a lot more fragile, and kind of why I made the decay of cinema video. I got a lot of comments being like, oh, you're just nitpicking and just complaining, but I really made that from a place of love, of loving film going, and loving the culture of movies, and wanting to hold on and cherish that. And that's something that I think, again, maybe won't ever die, but can certainly decay, and has decayed, I think, and could decay further. But it could also flourish anew. So, there's, as much as it's easy to focus on the pessimistic stuff in terms of things like theaters closing down and like the recent stuff with the ArcLight, but there's also a lot of positive stuff too. I mean, the fact that you do have niche outlets like Criterion Channel and the Criterion Collection more broadly, as well as stuff like Arrow and Shout Factory, is incredible. And I think communities like Letterboxd are really helpful. So, there's stuff to be optimistic about, stuff to be hopeful for. I'm certainly not a cinema's dead person. And I tend to think pretty positively. But I think the main concerns are less about the films and the filmmakers and more the culture. The Duke of Tumwater asks, what's a movie that you like but everyone else hates? A couple of years ago, I would have said the Matrix sequels, because there was definitely a time when those movies were very highly derided in culture, and I've always been a huge fan of them. But there does seem to be more of a cultural shift on the Matrix, and the Matrix sequel specifically, and on the Wachowski sisters' filmography post-Matrix in general. So I feel a little bit less certain saying that's a movie I love that everyone, or I guess a set of movies that I love that everyone else hates, because there is a lot more of a open admiration and passion for them, which I love to see. So I guess the big one would be Man of Steel, which I mentioned in my last Q&A video is a hot take I have. I love the film and always have, which might surprise some people, but I think it captures a sense of grandeur that is lacking in a lot of superhero films, and I don't know, I really respond to its style and sense of awe. But that's one too that I see the culture shifting on, or at least the reputation of Zack Snyder really shifting. You know, back when Man of Steel came out and a couple years after, there was a general sense that Zack Snyder was perceived as like this uber hack that had somehow lucked his way into making, you know, multi-million-dollar movies, but he was actually like horribly untalented and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And now that's really shifted into people being like, actually, Zack Snyder seems pretty good. And then not just, you know, the hardcore Snyder bros, but more largely within film communities, there's a general sense of reevaluating Zack Snyder. It hasn't necessarily rubbed off on Man of Steel, which I still think is looked at fairly divisively and in some circles derisively, but I do sense a sense of a cultural shift on that film, which I would love to see because I love the film and I think it deserves a lot better. Alexandra Machado asks, if you could choose, what movie, TV show, or short would you add to the Criterion Collection? I think I'd add the films She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel, which were both starring Mae West, written by Mae West. They are functionally really her movies. I actually wrote my master's thesis in large part on Mae West and the production code, and I think those films, her first two films, she'd made one other film before, but only as a bit part. These were really her star vehicles, are pretty important in film history in terms of seminal examples of pre-code cinema and the type of humor that one could inject in that era. And I also think they're very subversive proto-feminist texts, which again is a lot of what my MA thesis was about. And I also think they're really funny, especially She Done Him Wrong, which is, you know, runs a short 60 minutes, which is part of the other reason why I think it and I'm No Angel should be probably bundled together as a release, because they're both very short, and I think they work really well as complementary texts. But they're very funny, they're very quick-witted and sharp, and Mae herself is such an interesting screen presence that still, you know, almost 90 years later is singular and still massively influential. So yeah, I think in terms of, like, there are other films that maybe I'd like to see more as like a collector, or as like I just want to own that on Blu-ray, but in terms of films that like really the Criterion channels, the Criterion Collection's rather mission of historical significance and artistic significance, I think Mae West needs to be in there, and I think those two films are the ones that need to be there. So Blind Stove 91, what is your opinion on the films of Jean-Luc Godard and the French New Wave as a whole? So I like the French New Wave. There's still a lot I haven't seen. A lot of what I have seen is limited to sort of major texts like 400 Blows and some of the other early Truffaut films like Shoot the Piano Player and Jules and Jim, as well as stuff like Hiroshima Mon Amour. And it also gets tricky when you talk about someone like Jacques Demy, whose first two films, Lola and Bay of Angels, I think are pretty firmly French New Wave films, but when you get into his musicals like Umbrellas of Cherbourg and The Young Girls of Rochefort, God, that took me way too long to remember. When you get to those films, they come out in the era of the French New Wave, and, you know, Demy's technically a French New Wave filmmaker, but they're stylistically a million miles removed from a lot of what the New Wave was doing. Do they still count? I would argue yes, probably, but I'm not really an expert, so others might disagree with me on that. But yeah, I like the New Wave. As for Jean-Luc Godard, he's pretty firmly in the I respect in a lot of ways, but I don't particularly like, and I don't particularly like a lot of his films. Not to be entirely negative, I quite like Breathless, especially the first half, and I really like Contempt and Alphaville. But as Godard moved through the 60s and towards the end of the decade, when he started becoming increasingly sort of anti-narrative and making these more meta sort of essay films about politics and the culture of France and Americanization, I get increasingly distanced and stop caring, which is interesting because one of the professors who had the most profound influence on me and still does is a massive Godard fan and showed a lot of his works, and I think he's interesting to study. I've had very stimulating discussions about Godard. I like reading about Godard's films and reading critiques of the films. Actually watching his later films, I find can get pretty tedious, and I haven't seen anything other than bits of his history of cinema. I haven't seen anything post the late 60s, so from the sounds of it, I don't think I'd like what he made after anymore. In fact, I'd probably like it a lot less. But his films that do hit with me, they do interest me enough that I want to keep exploring his work, even if a lot of it leaves me a little bit cold and, if I'm being totally honest, kind of bored. Maniconta asks, what film courses did you take that made you better at film analysis? Really good question. I think in general, if you're looking at film theory courses are really good just because they give you, in exploring a lot of different theory, they give you the tools to help analyze films. So regardless of the films you actually look at in the course, the theory you get, the tools that you get, you can take with you and apply elsewhere. A lot of intro courses in general will be good for this too, because they'll offer a wide breadth of materials that, again, you can draw on yourself. I think also any courses that, regardless of their specific focus, are rooted in a specific time and setting, a specific history basically, are super helpful in terms of the essays you'll have to write, which will often involve drawing on in your research on both historical documents and academic works and combining those to conduct analysis. Extremely useful skills that I draw on with pretty much every video I make. DW Rocket asks, if you could find any lost film or lost cut of a film, presumably in the closet of a nearby abandoned mental hospital, naturally, what would you most want to find? I mean, pretty easy answer for me, The Magnificent Ambersons or Kurosawa's The Idiot. Both, I mean, Amberson's story is pretty famous of, a huge chunk of the film was cut out and the reels were thrown into the sea while Wells was filming a documentary for the US government, and that stuff's just gone. And you can really tell when you watch the film. I mean, the first maybe act of it is still, a lot's missing, but it still feels mostly intact. But once the story starts to move on, it starts to feel like a lot of chunks is missing, and it's at 80 minutes, it feels, like it's missing its core. And I don't know if necessarily the full version, if we ever found it, would be like a Kane level masterpiece, but there's enough brilliance in what we do have that I really would just love to see whatever that final version could look like. Kurosawa's The Idiot is less well known than Wells's Ambersons. It was his follow-up to Rashomon, so in some ways he just broken through at an international level as or rather was just about to, because I don't think the film had showed at Venice yet, but he was on the cusp of his sort of stardom and the cusp of his powers as a filmmaker when he releases his adaptation of Dostoevsky, and it's originally intended as this massive epic and something like an hour and 15 minutes or an hour and 45 minutes or something. I don't remember the exact amount, but over an hour of footage gets hacked out. And again, it shows. And the film that we're left with, I have a lot of mixed feelings about. Even if it was fully restored, I don't know if it would be a Rashomon or Seven Samurai level masterpiece. But what we do have, there's a lot of brilliance in there, particularly with that film. Kurosawa's blocking and his cinematography, his sense of a wintry atmosphere, all of that stuff resonates beautifully. So even in its fractured state, it's definitely worth seeing. But yeah, I mean, it's very clear that much is missing, and I would be very curious to see that restored. Joel Wittich asks, when you're done with Bergman Cinema, will you also do something like that with other directors, the essential Federico Fellini, for example? Bold of you to assume I'm ever going to finish Bergman Cinema. It's a massive set, and there's almost 40 films in it, and as people who've been following the channel for a long time might have noticed, it's been a long time since I've made a Bergman Cinema video. They've basically been a yearly attraction. Once a year I do another season of 5 videos on 5 films. And I was hoping to do season 3 possibly later this summer as a kind of make it a sort of spring/summer series around that time. But they are a ton of work to make, and they are reliably the things I make that get the lowest amount of views, and by a pretty wide margin. The Summer with Monica video is an exception. That one did pretty well over time. which might be because it's easily the most popular film of the first 10 I've looked at. It might be because the thumbnail has a sexy lady on it. I don't know. I don't run the algorithm. But this is a good time to address, I would like to make more. They're fun to make. I mean, the set's, right over there. They're fun to make, and they're really rewarding, and it's also fun to just go through the films. But if it's a series that most of my audience doesn't really care about, I don't know, that's worth noting, I guess, moving forward. So I'm undecided about, canceling the series or keeping it going, but if you, as a viewer, you would like to see more Bergman Cinema, if you want to just comment, I don't know, Bergman in the comment section, that'd be really helpful to me just to get a general sense of, if this is something people actually want to see or not. As to your question about whether I'll do something like that for other directors, like Fellini, never say never. I probably wouldn't do it the same way I did the Bergman one, just because it's, so much work and so much time of doing, a video per film. But certainly, there's a very good chance I will do more director-focused videos or series of videos in the future. I actually have another one that I'm planning sort of vaguely at the moment. It won't be ready for a long time, probably at least a year, so don't wait up for it, but something is in the works. Juan Pablo Rosado asks, what is your favorite film decade or film movement? French New Wave, Greek Weird Wave, etc. I mean, there's so many that you could choose. I'm like a lot of, I think, film buff, film bro type people. I love the New Hollywood of the late 60s through to the late 70s, mid to late 70s, depending on when you define the cutoff point. But I find that era fascinating, and it's something I've spent a lot of time studying. I also really love the early to mid 1960s, before Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate really sort of steered film culture and Hollywood specifically to where it was going, because you have this really interesting mix of old Hollywood hanging on, and these the big roadshow productions getting bigger and bigger and more money being poured into them, and some of them doing really well and a lot of them doing really poorly. So you have this sort of the last gasp of old Hollywood, and then you have these sort of avant-garde films that are really pushing the envelope but still have a 1 foot kind of firmly rooted in old Hollywood culture. The Manchurian Candidate is a fantastic example of a film like that, where it has the acting to me in a lot of places feels very modern and nuanced, and the filmmaking, certainly the themes of the film are wildly ahead of their time and also of their time at the same time, which is pretty amazing to watch. But at the same time, some of the dialogue and some of the filmmaking decisions also feel very much a piece of old Hollywood, and Frank Sinatra even being the star of the film feels like a holdover from an earlier era of film. So it's this kind of fascinating mix of a film that's really pushing to what Hollywood was going to become shortly. In many ways, the first 70s paranoia thriller, but is still a part of old Hollywood too. And I love that tension, and I love the films that you see building to that point of change in film history. I love even though I'm still relatively a novice to it, the golden age of Japanese cinema, which basically spans post-World War II, late 40s to maybe mid-1960s, late 1960s. I mean, the main figure for me there is Kurosawa, who I've seen way more of his than anybody else in the movement, but I've been expanding my knowledge of Mitsuguchi, Ozu, and Kobayashi, which has been hugely rewarding. You also have filmmakers in there like Kento Shindo, who are maybe the next tier of filmmakers, but also make some brilliant stuff. Someone like Hiroshi Teshigahara is probably more Japanese New Wave than Golden Age of Japanese cinema, but his movies do start to come out around that same time period, so still an area I want to explore more of, but one I've found endlessly rewarding. My Owen Opinion asks, what are your favorite debates from cinema? Example, is Deckard human a replicant, and did Mookie do the right thing? Great question. I'll give you two. One is from The Manchurian Candidate, speaking of John Frankenheimer's masterpiece. Is Janet Leigh's character a Soviet operator, and is Sinatra's character another Manchurian Candidate, essentially? Because the dialogue they have on the train is so bizarre and so weird. It doesn't sound like a conversation human beings would have. It's just so strange. But the prevailing theory that a lot of fans have is that those lines are essentially the Sinatra character's equivalent of Raymond, why don't you pass the time by playing a little solitaire? It's the sort of code word that will trigger, his brain to respond in a certain way and be susceptible to control. And the idea is that Janet Leigh is also one such operator, and Sinatra's character is like a plan B in case things go wrong with Raymond. There's some debate that just exists to justify the weirdness of the dialogue, and maybe that's true, but the reason this is one of my favorite movie debates is because I think it's not just a fun question for fans, it really adds a lot to the film. Because one of the things that's so compelling about the film, and again, kind of goes back to what I was saying about it as a product of old Hollywood and new, in old Hollywood, and especially under the production code, evil must be vanquished by the end. And that's technically true at the end of The Manchurian Candidate. The good guys win, but it doesn't really feel like they won. It's a very dark and cynical and sad ending. And when you add the layer of and it's possible that it's not really over, because it's possible Sinatra is next, that adds another layer of just despair to the whole thing that I really like. The other debate I like having is in 2001: A Space Odyssey, why does Hal incorrectly predict that the AE-35 unit, I think it's the AE-35 unit, is going to go offline? Now, the book gives a very clear-cut reason for why this happens, but in the movie, it's left ambiguous. It could be a genuine mistake, because computers make mistakes too. It could be a malfunction. It could be a choice made out of malice. One idea I like toying with is that it was in some way influenced by whatever the alien entity in the story is, the monolith, essentially. I don't have any proof that I can point to definitively in the text and say that's how we know that the aliens were involved in Hal making that mistake. But we do know they've interfered in humans' lives before, so it's not totally unreasonable to think they would do so here again, especially when they're the ones who've engineered this mission in the first place. Phoenix is a Bay Grid asks, I don't know if I said that even a little bit right, Phoenix, you'll have to let me know. Any chance you could make a list of your top 20 favorite movies? Maybe. I never really thought about it as a video. I don't know if that's something people would be interested in, but I could. I know recently, twice now, I've done 10 movies on Criterion Channel you could watch, and they were sort of motivated by pandemic, quarantine times. A lot of us are spending a lot of time at home and not able to go out and do things. Fun way to pass the time. But I really enjoy making those videos. I think they're fun, and they're a fun way to steer other people to some interesting movies. If that's something people like, I would love to do that maybe once a year, around March, April. Just 10 more movies on Criterion Channel to check out. It's not quite the same as a favorite movies list, but I think it also can encourage some interesting film watching. And it also is fun for me because whenever those get made, I kind of ask, you guys, what do you recommend? And I get a lot of fun recommendations too. So that's something I'd like to do every year if you guys like it. As far as doing a top 20 favorite movies list, maybe, if that's something people would want to see, I could do that. And it's always nice to have something that I can make that's a little, well, in this case, a lot less research intensive and a lot less sort of me trying to form an analytical either critique or perspective or whatever, and just to kind of let my hair down and have fun. So, yeah, I could. Matt the Snapper asks, do you have any plans to make a video where you discuss films you consider under or overrated? Interesting question. I find underrated and overrated sort of pieces, whether they're written or video, are tricky because what is overrated or underrated is so subjective to your perception and the circles you travel in. To give an example, I was having a conversation with a friend recently, and he was putting forth that he thinks Tenet is really overrated. And I said, if anything, I'm closer to thinking it's an underrated movie, which sounds insane because it was very well reviewed, and there's certainly a legion of Chris Nolan fans who will defend everything he makes. But in the circles I travel in, and especially on Twitter, that film is discussed in very dismissive terms, very negative terms, and very sort of a lack of interest in it or what it's doing. And even a lot of the positive defenses I see of the film are basically, it's just dumb fun, which I don't think is fair to it at all, and I think is really misleading, actually. Certainly if you go on YouTube and just search Tenet failure, there are tons of video reviews and essays that are like, why Tenet is a failure, Chris Nolan's continued failures, Tenet, the best kind of failure. And to me, this just all seems absurd. I understand why Tenet would not be for everybody, and I don't think it's one of Nolan's best movies, but I think it's doing some really fascinating and interesting things, and is doing things that not a lot of, well, that no other filmmakers are really doing at that scale. And while I can see why that wouldn't be for everybody, and I'm not saying the film is perfect, there's certainly a lot to criticize, it's the overall dismissal that I see of the film strikes me as unfair. Now, would that be enough to say the film is underrated? I don't know. Probably not, because again, still well reviewed, and had the release schedule been normal, I'm sure it would have done pretty well financially. But from my perspective, I see enough bile of it that to me, it feels like an underrated movie. So all that to say, doing any type of video that is, this thing is overrated or underrated is hard because it's easy to call that perspective out as false. If I did a video what Tenet is underrated, people could easily say, well, actually, no, it's overrated, and here's why. So I don't know if I would do a video that was strictly focused like that. That said, when I do my videos, I'm often looking for interesting ways I can present material or at first approach it. So it might not be the thesis of my video that X is under or overrated, but it might inform how I discuss it or how I frame the material, especially in the introductions of my videos. So there's no plans to do an underrated or overrated video at the moment, but as a framing device, it's something that I could potentially do. Although if you are interested in that type of video, one of the first videos I ever made was actually that about the Matrix sequels. It's called something like The Matrix Sequels Are Overbashed and Undervalued, or Underappreciated, something like that. If you like that type of video, check it out. It's very old at this point. I haven't watched it in years. I have no idea how it holds up, but the arguments I stand by, so there's that. Catherine Alvarez asks, have you ever read Fairy by Raymond Feist or any other fantasy series set in Hollywood? I haven't. I actually don't read nearly as much fiction as I would like to, which is something I'd like to work on. Lex Luthor asks, what are your thoughts on the Snyder Cut? Well, Lex, I'm glad you asked. Actually, in all sincerity, I'm really glad this was asked because I do feel like I need to address this on camera. So, some viewers might remember that about a year ago, I made a video called Fan Entitlement and the Quick Fix, which was about modern fandoms and fan cultures that when their franchises go wrong, demand it be fixed with remakes or, removing a text from continuity and trying again, or fixing it after release, or some such other fix. And I talk a lot about the #Release the Snyder Cut movement. This was before the Snyder Cut was announced as coming to HBO Max. And I want to be fair to my past self and say that the thesis of the video was a lot less, the Snyder Cut will definitely be bad, and a lot more about how the culture of fandoms run in ways that are antithetical to art. That said, I did say some very uncharitable things about the Snyder Cut. Most prominently when I asked the hypothetical, is there any way the Snyder Cut could fix Justice League, and responded with a firm, absolutely not. Which, is laying one stand pretty clear. A year later, now the Snyder Cut is out. Did it prove me wrong? I don't think it did completely, but overall, yes. To say the headline, the Snyder Cut is a massive improvement over the theatrical release of Justice League. Characters like Cyborg and The Flash, who were just kind of showed up before, especially Cyborg, are really the heart of the movie, and they have character and place in the story, and they really matter. The scale of the story actually resonates. The story's the same, and I don't think it's all that good, but at least in this version, you feel the weight of the threat that the characters face, and the momentousness of the Justice League forming as a team actually resonates, whereas again, in the theatrical cut, they just kind of become a team, and it's not that special or grand. And speaking of special and grand, and something that I, didn't fully clock when I saw the theatrical version, how cut down the action scenes were. Because a lot of the same action scenes in the Snyder Cut don't feel like the same action scene because so many of the pieces of them were truncated and cut that, yes, the scene still communicated the same things, but without the scale and the grandeur that is now in the Snyder Cut. Okay, so my original recording at this point just cut off because I ran out of space. So I was talking about the Snyder Cut and the action scenes. Basically, that the action scenes in the Whedon Cut were the same, but they were so truncated that they lacked their sort of impact. And when you're making superhero spectacle, you want that sense of grandeur. So I do think the Snyder Cut's better. That said, I don't think it necessarily fixes the film fully. I still think that Steppenwolf is an awful antagonist. This version makes him more motivated, but less threatening. So ultimately, I think the character is a modest improvement probably in this new version, but still not a very engaging or compelling villain for me. Darkseid and Martian Manhunter are probably fun for fans to see, and I am a fan, I recognize them. But again, they don't add much to the story. Darkseid in particular is like a non-character. Him, Desaad, and Steppenwolf all kind of blend together in a way as like these, CGI monster things that talk vaguely about this world will fall kind of stuff. So, I don't know, they kind of blended together. Martian Manhunter's scenes were just weird. The new scene between Lois and Martha Kent is actually really good and so much better than the version in the theatrical cut. But then it's revealed that one of the characters was Martian Manhunter the whole time, and it's like, why? Like, it was a more interesting dramatic scene when it's just these two women genuinely, sharing this moment. And I think the epilogue of the film added with Jared Leto's Joker is fucking terrible. And I kind of like the visuals of the nightmare world, but it's such a pointless addition to the story that at that point is all wrapped up, and Jared Leto's... Something's going on out there. And Jared Leto's Joker is the worst Joker in the history of the character. If there is a worse version of the character somewhere, I haven't seen it. So overall, Snyder Cut thoughts, it is better, and it did prove me wrong, and it did impress me, and to an extent, I probably would consider watching it again. I don't think it really fixes the film fully, though, and I don't like it as much as Man of Steel, for example. But it's definitely better than Batman v Superman, and it's definitely better than the theatrical cut of Justice League. Doomsday asks, what are your favorite movie scores? My absolute number one, I listen to a lot of film scores generally, but my absolute best is Ennio Morricone's score for Once Upon a Time in the West. Not only because I think the music is awesome and brilliant, but I cannot think of a better fusion in the history of film of audio and visual material as that film. Leone shot to music, and it shows because it's so precise, the combination of imagery and music, that it's operatic and unlike anything else in film history. Nothing, because other films do maybe similar things or aspire to similar ends, but I don't think anything is as grand as the combination of music and visuals as it is in that film. In terms of more modern composers, I'll quickly give a shout out to Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. To get my biases out of the way, I love Nine Inch Nails, so obviously I'm, a bit predisposed to liking their work already, but I think they're doing some of the most interesting and unique work in film scoring of anybody right now, and they're kind of exceptional in that I think I would watch just about any movie just to hear their score to it. They're that good. It's not just that the music they make is good and appropriate for the material, but that it really elevates the material and is unique to itself. The BT Skink asks, favorite acting performance from a non-professional actor put into a professional film? I'm going to say the entire cast of the Battle of Algiers, other than the actor playing Colonel Mathieu, I believe is his name, who is a professional actor. I think everyone else in that film is a non-professional, and that's exceptional to me for two reasons. One, usually when non-actors are cast in films, it's usually to play in sort of everyday life. And Battle of Algiers is not that. It's essentially it's a movie about guerrilla warfare. And then when you think it through, like, okay, well, maybe this is for certain people everyday life. And that takes on a certain weight to it. But the other reason I find the cast just exceptionally good is that Battle of Algiers is so sparse in its characterization. It's really so committed to a documentary aesthetic. There's nothing in terms of like character dialogue or exposition of who people are. It's so sparse. I don't know anything about the characters really, and yet the actors are so good at imbuing a sense of passion and intensity and humanity on screen that I really empathize and root for them, even if they aren't given traditional characterization. So I think those actors deserve a ton of credit for that. Josh Price asks, have you fixed this yet? And if not, then why? And when he asks that, he's referring to this tweet. No, I have not seen the Paddington movies yet. The main reason is because Only the first one is available to me on streaming right now, and it's the second one that really has the lavish levels of praise. Obviously, I want to see the first one before I see the second one, but I was thinking when I do watch them, I maybe will try to have them in relatively close proximity, and I don't want to watch the first one, say, tomorrow, and then wait, I don't know, months for Paddington 2 to come my way. Also, in general, when there's only one there, I just have less motivation to go and watch them. But I am curious to see the films, and I am interested, so I'll get to it eventually. Probably not tomorrow, though. Haphazard Stuff asks, what's a film you hold a nostalgic affection for from your youth that you now realize isn't all that great, but whose love for it you just cannot shake? Well, it's interesting that you asked this question, Haphazard Stuff, because immediately reading it, my mind went to James Bond movies. And of course, you are, I think, most known on YouTube for your excellent Bond videos. And not all Bond films, there's certainly a lot that I'd argue are genuinely really good and great, but there's also a lot that are a bit more middling that I let get away with a lot for the sake of the fun elements they offer. Movies like You Only Live Twice or Live and Let Die come to mind, which are not horrible, but they definitely have a lot of really questionable and kind of bad stuff in them that I let slide because there's lots of fun James Bond goodness. But the more I think about it, the more I think those probably aren't the best examples, because yes, as much as they have a lot of really weird creative choices, they are, I think, genuinely good. And I could argue their strengths without having to rely on nostalgia, or at least fully on nostalgia. The same cannot be said for Die Another Day, which your own video on that film certainly comes to mind, which I will say this. I can recognize the film as bad and pretty dumb and has a lot of bad things about it, but I can't fully dislike it. I still find it kind of endearing and entertaining. Maybe that is a lot of nostalgia because it was one of the first Bonds I remember watching a lot when I was a little kid. I think I was like 8 years old when it came out, so I was kind of the right age for that version of James Bond. But I don't know, I find for as you know, as dumb as the story and filmmaking are, there's something unabashedly pure about it. Like, it's not hiding what it is. It's very upfront about what kind of movie it's presenting itself as, and if you watch it at the right wavelength, I think it's kind of endearing, even if it's still kind of bad and hard to defend. Randall the Vandal, what's the best metal soundtrack or needle drop in a movie? Also, what's one metal song that you would like to see used in a movie that hasn't been already? Overall, metal soundtracks are tough because I find that very few soundtracks are like pure metal. I mean, stuff like The Matrix or Nine Inch Nails comes to mind, but they also have a lot of more techno stuff and alt-rock, respectively, although they are very good and they serve their films really well. Something else that comes to mind is Dazed and Confused, which is definitely more 70s hard rock than it is metal, but there are metal tracks on it, and it's also just one of the best soundtracks ever. In terms of best metal needle drop in a movie, I think it's got to be E5150 / Mob Rules by Black Sabbath from the animated classic Heavy Metal. The E5150 part of the song, which is all ambient sort of electronic sounds and before building into like this really sick Tony Iommi riff, is played over like this sort of nomad caravan who's cast out into the desert, finding this mutated waste that turns them into this marauding monsters. And then as they transform and then siege the city that had previously outcast them, it turns into Mob Rules. And not a very sophisticated scene, but it's a lot of fun, and the Sabbath riffs are really appropriate for what's going on.
To the council chamber!
In terms of a song, I don't have a specific song I'd like to see more in movies, but generally speaking, Judas Priest is my favorite band of all time, and I think I'd like to hear them more on film soundtracks. If nothing else, I think they have enough variety in the music they've made over their 50-year career that you can get a lot of versatility from that band and their tracks. So more Judas Priest in movies, and not breaking the law. Like, no disrespect to that song, but we can do better. We can find deeper cuts. Mouse Pounder asks, have you seen The City of Lost Children, and what did you think of it? I haven't. I had a very bad experience with Jean-Pierre Jeunet's prior film, Delicatessen, which I could recognize some of the craft to, but I found just really unpleasant and hard to sit through, so I haven't got around to City of Lost Children yet. but I am fascinated by the premise, so I probably will get to it eventually, and when I do, I will let you know what I thought of it. Tim Rooney asks, in the 1970s, which of the movie Brat Pack had the best run, in your opinion? Gotta be Francis Ford Coppola. Scorsese and Spielberg and De Palma all make valid claims to the throne, but Coppola gives us Godfather 1 and 2 and Apocalypse Now and The Conversation and writes Patton. He wins. It's all hits and no dogs. He owned the 1970s. Moonrunner asked, what's your favorite Brazilian movie? I've seen remarkably few. I actually checked Letterboxd and the number is very low, and some of them that are there don't really count as Brazilian movies. They're Hollywood movies that shot a scene in Brazil. So of the Brazilian movies I've seen that are legitimately Brazilian, easily City of God. One of the best movies ever made. Sorry, my cats are slamming on the outside door, so if you heard a loud bang, it's just my cat giving herself a concussion. Andy Roach, my question is it normal that the killing of a sacred deer haunts me almost daily? I don't know if it's normal, but I get it. It's a haunting movie, so. Sean Scullion asks, what films or films from the 2010s would you consider to be underrated? I'm actually going to highlight a movie that's not strictly underrated so much as it is just really underseen, and that's Beyond the Hills. My patrons will know this as recently being the number one movie I watched in April. It's from Christian Mungiu, who directed 4 Months, 3 Weeks, and 2 Days, and is just a phenomenal Romanian drama about religion and, we'll say, religion's power in society. And I'm going to leave it vaguely at that, because I really think a lot of the pleasures of this movie are watching its story unfold, how it seems at first like it's going to be a very slow, character-centered drama, and it is a character-centered drama, and it's very thematic, but it's not necessarily slow. The story really picks up and goes into dramatic, dangerous, violent places pretty quickly. Most people who've seen it, at least by what I've seen on Letterboxd, seem to really like it, and there's a lot of talk of it being this great film. It's in the Criterion Collection, but it's so massively underseen. Even compared to 4 Months, 3 Weeks, and 2 Days, it has a far more narrow audience, and that's a real shame, because it's one of the best films I've seen in quite a while. I feel like I should like McCabe and Mrs. Miller a lot more than I do. It's a deconstructionist Western, which is very much my jam. It's an early 70s sort of staple of New Hollywood. It's one of Robert Altman's most acclaimed films. I love the cast. I love the atmosphere of the film. I love how it operates as a deconstructionist Western, because unlike, say, the gangster movie, which was really revived by Bonnie and Clyde in the late 60s in a sort of massive way, there was a lot of high-profile deconstructionist Westerns at this, or maybe not even deconstructionist, but a lot of high-profile Westerns that were experimenting with the form at this time, with stuff like what Leone was doing with the spaghetti Westerns, and with Once Upon a Time in the West, with The Wild Bunch, and then the more traditional Hollywood stuff like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which just feels like the old Western moved into the late 60s, early 70s. So I really like where McCabe and Mrs. Miller sits within that history, because I think it approaches the genre from a really different way, and even how it goes about genre deconstruction is notably different from Bonnie and Clyde does with the gangster movie. And yet, in spite of all that, and in spite of recognizing the film's clear value, I never really love it when I watch it. I like it, I recognize a lot of its skill, but it never reaches to that top shelf place that I feel like it should be for me, because it feels like everything I should love. But that being said, every so often I'm called back to I should probably rewatch McCabe and Mrs. Miller. So who knows? If I force feed it enough, maybe I will convince myself that I actually do love it. And finally, we're going to close out with Allison, who asks, best band in the big four of thrash metal? Metallica, which I guess is not surprising, based on how I chose to dress for today. I know this is kind of the obvious choice because they're easily the most popular and, mainstream rock act. And you can, write volumes about the musical direction they took moving into the 90s. It's definitely not to my taste. I much prefer the thrash metal era, and I have a lot of mixed feelings about what they made post the Cliff Burton years. But at the end of the day, Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, and Master of Puppets, the first 3 Metallica albums, are about as perfect as heavy metal gets. So they take the crown. And that is a wrap on my second Q&A video. Raw recording time was very long, so hopefully I can cut this down to a reasonable length. My thanks to everyone who sent in questions. I hope this was a fun watch. In terms of the future, next video essay should be up shortly. It's actually already available for patrons. It's about being John Malkovich, so if that interests you, you can head on over to Patreon and see it early, or you can wait. And in terms of other places you can find me, I actually recently started a podcast with my friend Ian. It's called Cinema in Seconds, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts, Spotify, Apple Music, Stitcher. We talk about little movie moments, so instead of focusing on like the famous movie scenes that everyone knows or the big set pieces, we talk about really little elements we love in movies and why they're important to us. So if that sounds like something you'll like, look us up. It's a pretty fun show, and yeah, I guess I'll see you again for my next Q&A video, which would probably be 50,000 subscribers? Maybe? I don't know. I'll see you then, I guess. Take care, everybody.